Hi, everyone. I'm Gold Derby News and Features Editor Ray Richmond, and I'm here today with Willie Gladstone, the Oscar-nominated actor who stars with Riley Keough and a dynamic supporting cast in the eight-part Hulu limited series docudrama Under the Bridge that premiered May 1st. The series is based on the 2005 book of the same name by Rebecca Godfrey that tells the heartbreaking story of the real-life 1997 murder of Rena Verk, a 14-year-old Indo-Canadian girl in British Columbia who was the victim of intense bullying that led to her death. Lily, you play the role of Cam Bentland, an Indigenous policewoman and a character created for the adaptation. What about this role made it attractive for you?
I was very intrigued about the arc that was laid out. When I was first approached about it, I was a little hesitant. It's coming out of Killers of the Flower Moon, another true crime. It's if you look at all of the representation for Native women on television, like 4 out of 5 roles as a cop. So I was wondering, how is this one going to stand out from the other ones? Are we going to make a character that's, dare I say, like possibly a trope? So I was a little hesitant at first, but knowing that Riley was attached caused me to lean in because
Oh,
mention of Cam in this world. Did I freeze?
you froze for a second there.
Okay, sorry.
No
Um,
problem.
so when I was meeting first with Quinn and Samir and talking about this invention of Cam and about, like you said, her being an Indigenous cop, and as you find out in the first few episodes, an adopted um, woman into her family. She became a cop because that's what her family did, who adopted her. That setup alone kind of alerted me to a few maybe systemic things, especially in Canada, that hopefully were going to be discussed. So in the first meeting, I kind of had a list of like, are we gonna have this conversation? Is this going to happen? And all of that was laid out. So I thought that was really exciting. That without, I don't want to run the risk of spoiling it for anybody, but the 8 episode arc that Cam goes on is a really interesting one. It's a really difficult one, and I thought it was a very important invention, and placing this fictional character in this world to have another conversation of really a lot of systemic injustices in Canada, because Rena Burke's case was so it was so tragic, and it was such a wake up call on a lot of different fronts. I know that her case very much changed missing persons protocol in Victoria and British Columbia, and then I think eventually in all of Canada. And missing persons cases are all too familiar to Indigenous communities. The epidemic of missing murdered Indigenous relatives was the close of Visibility Week, this first week of May, and it's just as bad in Canada as it is in the United States. So I thought it was really an important thing to include an Indigenous character in this conversation, because Raina Burke's case kind of changed and had a ripple effect for a lot of Indigenous missing women as well.
Are you are you happy to continue to play Indigenous characters, Lily? Are you also? I'm imagine you're also hoping to play women whose background is more incidental.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, what did Danny DeVito say? Any character he plays, they're all going to be short. It's
It's a good line.
it is a good line. It's great. So any character I find myself in, there's going to be Indigenous representation carried in that character. So I feel like whether or not it's explicitly like part of a plot, or if it's having an Indigenous identity, a Native identity is crucial to the conversations of the piece. It's like, as long as it's done in a really like meaningful way, absolutely. It's also just, it's kind of time to see us in roles where people have historically not. Like you look at Alakwa Cox and Echo, it's like we have a Native superhero essentially. And yeah, I think by and large, we're hoping that by having so much Indigenous talent working right now, myself included, we can work in spheres where we bend people's perceptions about where we belong, because in reality we belong and truly are everywhere. I mean, one personal anecdote I always reach for is I was in Vienna for the first time I left the country, and I met a Blackfeet Viennese born man. So like we're literally everywhere.
Absolutely. No, I mean, you personally are upping the profile of indigenous performers, which is wonderful and admirable, just through all the attention you got in Killers of the Flower Moon. But in terms of Under the Bridge, you know, it almost plays like a female version of Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
It's just painful and harrowing to watch.
Yeah.
Incredibly well acted and produced. I I imagine you're pretty happy with the result, having seen the whole thing.
Well, it's incredible. And I actually haven't seen the whole thing. I'm kind of on the same ride with everybody else.
Oh,
I mean, I've read all the scripts and I was there for shooting the
I,
final
I
episodes.
won't spoil it for you.
I do know what happens. But no, it's tremendous. Just the response too. People are really connecting with the show. It's a very well made show. It's impeccably acted. These kids are insanely talented. And they're all such kind, sweet, bright kids. You know, it's they're really acting. They're
They really are acting, because oh my God, this show shows teenagers to be just these bloodthirsty savages. Um, do you recall your own teens and what you were like yourself, Willie?
I was not as angry. I I was these kids' age. I was a little bit younger than these kids at this point in time. In '97, I was 11 years old, so I was entering into that adolescence, middle school space. Um, it's been a pretty nostalgic trip watching it and making it as well, because just immediately you remember what it was to be a middle schooler, to be navigating a world that's, you know, has a lot of really big issues and big conversations as you're just coming into forming your own identity, and how you know, you really lean into pop culture to give you a sense of self. And I kind of felt like watching it, I do remember the culture of the time. um as a kid myself, though, I was, you know, I've always been a little bit artsy, a little nerdy. At family reunions, I wasn't hanging out with my cousins my age. I was hanging out with, like, I was like babysitting the little kids or hanging out with the grown-ups. I've always kind of avoided adolescence, even though I was very much an adolescent. Um, yeah, I was a good student. I student student government for a lot of years, but yeah, I definitely, when I was younger, my parents gave me a remarkable amount of empathy for people who did bully me, because I certainly experienced that. I mean, I think being I don't know, being perceived as maybe a bit of a teacher's pet in some circles, it's like you're a prime target for it, or other circles where I'm just like a little bit overly exuberantly expressive and theatrical, that gets you bullied too. Like everything gets you bullied as a kid. But my bullies in my community, I recognized with the help of my parents that, like, you know, they're a part of our community and they deserve compassion, and they are bullying because they're hurt people. You know, you're a target for them because there's something they're expressing, some frustration from their own life that you have no control over, that has nothing to do with you. So I
Yeah.
just kind of remember feeling that, like, it sucked getting bullied, but early on my folks planted that compassion seed in me for people who were mean to me, because they're hurt people.
That's remarkably open-minded of your parents. I give them a lot of credit, because, middle school I found to be just, kind of a cesspool of horrible human behavior.
Oh yeah, totally. And I think where it becomes really insidious, where you don't have to tolerate it or have compassion, is when people are punching down.
Yeah.
And that's I think a lot of the bullying I experienced, there was the perception of, you know, these are kids who are having a rough time, so I can extend compassion. But then you get to, I think, particularly moving to the city away from the reservation during those years, suddenly class was an issue the way that it wasn't when I lived on the res. It's like nobody cared how much money people had, you know, but like suddenly you're in the suburbs and it's like, do you shop at Abercrombie and Fitch? Oh, you don't. And then like getting bullied for stuff like that. Like that was the kind of insidious stuff that I didn't have patience for and I didn't engage with. So yeah, it's the whole punching down element. And there's a lot of that explored in the show. Like all of the like it's one thing I really like about how Rebecca Godfrey focused her lens in making her book. And one thing I really like about what the series did was bringing Rena's Burke and her family's experience into it in a way more drawn out way. Because I think, Godfrey's book, you don't get to know much about Rena. There's very little that Rebecca could have written about Rena because she didn't know her. She wasn't personally involved in her life, but we were able to launch into that in the show more because we had Manjeet Burke's manuscript as well of the family's experience.
Did you know much about the Rena Burke case before you took on the, because I think it's far less known in the United States, obviously, than in Canada.
It is. It's very well known in Canada. I compare it to Matthew Shepard in the States. Everybody recognizes Matthew Shepard's name and how much that rocked everybody. And the important conversations that his murder raised. And Rena, I think, did the same thing in Canada. In Canada, I mean, culturally, Canada's a place that maybe Americans have this perception, but there's also this, knowing a lot of Canadians, there's this self-perception of Canada as being a very safe place. It's like, no, America's where everybody has a gun. That's where things are violent. That's, all the societal inequity is in America. We're this little utopia up here. So the idea that a girl could be singled out, excluded, and then bullied because of her race, that was like, people immediately shut down to that idea, but it was very much a factor. The way that her family was treated by law enforcement prior to her case, even, which you learn about in the most recent episode. Like Manjeet, her father, was terribly profiled. Rena rocked a lot of things up there in a way that I think woke people up. And I think that's what appealed to Rebecca Godfrey and shines through the book so much. Just this idea of this inverted sort of fairy tale. It's that,
Do you understand what could lead to the kind of behavior we see these girls display in this series?
I think it's different for each one of them, which is, I think, so important in how each one of them is sketched out. It's intent and impact are two different things. The impact on Rena was the same, regardless of, what the intent was from each of her bullies. But as you find, there was, in particular, like one girl in all of it, and then the way that it kind of shook out that bore a lot more of the responsibility for what happened to her. But yeah, when you look at just kind of the scope of the rest of her bullies, there's certainly an element of it where you're like, this is a pastime for these kids. And nobody intended, or not nobody, but a number of the kids that were involved in it, they had no intention of killing her. It's just pretty, there's that whole scene where you see there's this glorified culture of violence with the Crip initiation that Warren Blavatsky goes through. So kind of like this intrigue about it. And, I remember that from middle school, fights breaking out. It's just, adolescents are so powerful. They're coming online. They're like, they're developing a sense of identity. They're tackling and starting to conceptualize really big world things. And that can be so overwhelming and so scary. And a lot of people express that by grasping for power and, or everybody's just tuned up little like hormone bundles going at each other's throats. I remember suddenly you leave middle school or you leave elementary school and go into middle school and high school, and then now fights are breaking out. It's like,
that's how it is. Just to switch gears for a second here, Lily, you're on the other side of this rewarding, exciting, probably head spinning award season for Killers of the Flower Moon. Now that you've had a few months to recover, how do you look at that whole experience in hindsight?
I think I'm probably not going to fully metabolize it for years if I ever do. um, yeah, it's what is cool is you kind of develop this camaraderie with people who are going through it with you. And there's this sort of collective relief when you get to see each other on the other side of all of it. Like, I was at the Met Gala last night sitting next to Davine Joy Randolph, and we were just talking about how nice it was to be there and just be ourselves without like having a project that we were selling or that we were promoting, or it's like we're not getting asked the same 50 questions. We get to just show up, talk about what we're wearing, and have a nice evening, and just how nice that was.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
I really did think, though, you handled yourself with such class and grace, that whole time while making the interview and award show appearance rounds. You were even so chill about the Academy Awards. I mean, you were like, if I win, great. If I don't, great.
Yes, I said that on Marin, didn't I?
You weren't hinging your career on it, luckily.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think accolades are wonderful. They're meaningful. But what really is meaningful is the work. It's a gift to be able to do this and to keep doing this. And it's one of my favorite little interactions the whole like awards season was I got into a text or a DM conversation, a Twitter X conversation with John Lurie. And I love him. I love everything that he does. I love his art. I love his shows. But he said he was hesitant to root for me just because he doesn't believe in awarding art. And I totally understood that. I mean, it was a conversation Emma and I had a couple of times was how do you pit these very subjective things in competition with each other? It's like, I think what was nice about it was just having the chance to talk so much about a film that I really care about. And the whole campaigning of it felt like an opportunity to just unpack it with people because it's such a dense work and it's tied to so much meaningful history that is very relevant today. It was kind of an extension of a lot of work that I did before Killers of the Flower Moon when I was doing just a one-woman show going to high schools and middle schools teaching kids about boarding school history and the assimilation policy of Native Americans. And or going into reservation communities with acting workshops for kids, doing like self-expression and just getting to enjoy my craft that way and having a social impact. It felt like Killers of the Flower Moon, getting to talk about it. There was certainly a social impact element of that campaign, and I really enjoyed that part of it. It was just kind of nice to get to go to these awards and get to see people who I admire and watch I'm Just Ken and see the Osage singers on stage. It's like the whole experience of it was really fun.
Are there any projects, just before we wrap here, Lily, on your wish list that you're hoping to maybe try to push into being now that you have somewhat greater clout?
Yeah, there's I mean, one of the big gifts of people responding as well as they did to Killers of the Flower Moon, and particularly to the character Molly, to the woman who was Molly and her family and sisters, and that kind of leaning in and intrigue about what is this world that we want more of suddenly. Because that interest was high, Apple also decided to load up and buy Fancy Dance, a feature that I have coming out in June. So that was wonderful. Fancy Dance was made the year after Killers of the Flower Moon, but it premiered 10 months prior to it at Sundance the same year Killers came out. So it was nice. I got to enjoy the whole premiere and experience of Fancy Dance separate of Killers of the Flower Moon. Like it really stood on its own prior to it. But it took Killers of the Flower Moon for the culture to catch up to the conversations that we get to have in that film. And really, when audiences get to see Fancy Dance who have seen Killers of the Flower Moon, it feels very much like an extension because it is. It's the same history and the same landscape 100 years later. And the story hasn't really changed that much.
Well,
so
a great way.
that's...
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, and then I'm looking forward to doing some lighter things. I've got a comedy coming up next, and yeah, like longer term, it would be fun before like I don't know, before my knees can't handle it anymore, to get some kind of action at some point.
I want to see just Gladstone above the name of the film. You know,
Yeah.
like Stallone.
It's a good name for that, right?
It is actually. It's perfect.
Yep.
You know, I no, I really admire the way you're using your sudden fame here for good. You know, to really shine a light on your community. I think it's highly admirable.
Mhm. Yeah.
So congrats on that. I think we're going to leave things there. New episodes of Under the Bridge premiere each Wednesday on Hulu through May 29th. Lily Gladstone, best of luck to you this Emmy season and every season.
Thank
And
you.
thanks for joining us at Gold Derby.
Thank you so much for having me.